Hi, Zandy. I was talking with a friend over coffee who had been on the search committee for a senior leader, and the committee had detailed out a rubric of skills and competencies and experiences that defined exactly what they were looking for. And after what felt like a rigorous process, they confidently extended an offer to a candidate, and less than a year later, we're sitting in this coffee shop, and my friend tells me something to the effect of, and you know what we found out? He's exactly who we did not want. Maybe you can relate to the challenges of trying to determine if someone would be a good fit for your team or not. Perhaps they look good on paper, but there's this nagging concern that's just hard to describe. There's something missing, but it's kind of hard to put a finger on it. Or maybe it's someone that's been on your team for a while, and they're capable for sure, but there's just something that's holding them back. Today I'm excited to introduce you to Rich Diviney, who joins us to talk about his book, The Attributes: 25 Drivers of Optimal Performance. Rich is a retired Navy SEAL commander who completed more than a dozen overseas deployments, 11 of which were to Iraq and Afghanistan. He was the officer in charge of training for a specialized command and developed a way to understand why some applicants seemed to have the right stuff when others, though highly qualified, just didn't. The result is what Rich calls attributes. And we're talking about them today because it's not just relevant for Navy SEALs. I think you'll find them helpful for you and for your team as well. In today's episode, you'll learn about the difference between attributes and skills. We'll talk about some of the specific attributes that Rich has identified in his years with the SEALs and now working with organizations around the world. You'll learn about the difference between a high-performing team and an optimal performing team. There's so much more in today's discussion. It's a conversation I've been looking forward to sharing with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Let's jump into today's discussion with Rich about his book, The Attributes. Rich, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Yeah, Andy, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad you joined us. We'll get into ideas from your book in a bit, but before we do that, I just love hearing people's backstory. You mentioned in the book that you and your wife sometimes remark that you won the familial lottery. Can you think of anything from your family culture or early life growing up that helped form how you started to think about human behavior?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think I was fascinated growing up. My family, great family, and my dad was a private pilot, so we used to fly with him on the weekends, which kind of energized or ignited our love for flying, which kind of made my brother and I say, well, we want to be Navy pilots, and we're definitely joining the Navy to be pilots. So that's kind of was the impetus to join in the Navy in the first place. And then throughout growing up, I played sports and things like that. I was never really an athlete. I just played sports because it was a thing to do. I think I had a maybe an semblance of interest back then, but I think the interest really ignited when I went through SEAL training in '96. And you go through SEAL training, and for those in the audience who don't know, it's called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL Training, and it's in San Diego, California. And it's some of the hardest training in the world. I mean, 90% attrition rate. So my class, for example, started with about 170 people, and we've graduated 38 people. And I think it was then that was the first time I felt what I call a positive or helpful imposter syndrome. Right. In other words, I looked around and said, "How am I still here? What is it about us, this 38, that allowed us that's similar? How are we similar to each other, and what has it allowed us to do what we did?" I think that was the real impetus to my fascination with not only human performance, but kind of what I call elemental human performance. Who are we at our most raw? Who's that person that shows up, and how does that person look, and how does that person behave? Because I think understanding that is a real superpower.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I'd love to ask you. Like, how does a pilot have fear of heights? But how does a guy tell an established high-performing Navy officer that they're not going to make the cut? I mean, you had to do some really difficult things there, and it led to these attributes. And attributes to me, Rich, is not a term I would normally think about when I think of individuals or teams. I might think of personality, like sorting people by personality, or have certain beliefs about them, like they're trustworthy or they're not, or evaluate them based on skills. But none of those are attributes. So let's go with this. How do you like to differentiate skills from attributes, and why is that distinction so important?
Yeah, it's important because attributes are those drivers of elemental performance. At our most raw, we're running on attributes, and even personality, while fun and cool, and in fact, I like most of the personality tests. I think they're fun, and some of them are pretty accurate. They really only tell us how we behave in normal environments. And it's also made up of personality is made up of a bunch of different things. It's made up of, you know, belief systems, ideology, environments, attributes, of course, right? But there's a bunch of things that kind of, catalyze and stew together to create a personality. I will say though that usually in stress, challenge, uncertainty, when the what hits the fan, personality tends to go out the window, and we are running on these very raw things. And so the way I began to distinguish them was that skills are not inherent to our nature. In other words, none of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball. We're trained to do those things. We're taught to do those things. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. Here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then skills, because they're very visible, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can put scores around them. You can put statistics around them. You can put them on resumes, which is why we get seduced by skills often when we're picking or hiring. Right. The problem with skills is skills don't tell us how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. And so this is when we lean on our attributes. Attributes are different. Attributes are inherent to our nature. In other words, all of us are born with levels of adaptability, situational awareness, patience, okay? And you can certainly develop these things over time and experience, but, you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. And, anybody who has had kids or has kids or experienced kids will agree with me when I say that there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient, okay? Mm-hmm. So there's a nature-nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't direct our behavior. They inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. So for example, my son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up, and he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're hard to see, they're very hard to measure and assess. How do you measure or assess someone's levels of patience or adaptability, right? The idea, though, is these things show up the most viscerally and visibly during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And so if we're interested in not only our own performance during those times, but also our team's performance, when a project goes south, when the client gets mercurial, asks for stuff that they didn't ask for before, or things that the thing doesn't go as planned, this is when the best teams start to show up. And these teams that show up and can perform, they're running on these attributes and these qualities. And so we have to understand these inherent things. And just to kind of hammer home that point, I'll tell you a quick story. Yeah. There was and this was relayed to me. I guess it happened before I went to SEAL training. But the story goes that this kid showed up to SEAL training one day, and he walks into the instructor's offices and he says, "I want to be a Navy SEAL." And the instructor says, "Okay, well, fine. You have to do a swim test." And the kid says, "Okay." So they take him out to the pool. It's an easy swim test, 50 meters. So 25 meters to one end, 25 meters to the other end. Anyway, he gets all ready to go. He jumps in the pool, and when he jumps in the pool, he sinks right to the bottom of the pool. And he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches one end of the pool. He walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. He comes up. He's gasping for air, right, nearly drowning. And the instructor looks at him and says, "What the hell are you doing?" And the kid, who's still trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, "I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim." And at that point, the instructor looks at the kid and pauses and then says, "That's okay, we can teach you how to swim." So why did he say that? The instructor said that because he knew if this kid had the attributes, the qualities to show up to Navy SEAL training without knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him that he needed to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be easy. And so we separate these skills and attributes. Oftentimes when we're picking teams or even judging performance, we get seduced by these skills, and those aren't really the true indicators of performance if we're talking about stress, challenge, and uncertainty.
Man, I love that story because it illustrates how, Rich, I feel like sometimes, like I said in the intro, we hire the wrong person because we're looking at the wrong things, and somebody who didn't have the resume or quite the experience, but they walked the bottom of the pool. They're the person we're going to hire. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, that's great. Just real quick related to that, I feel like some of this may sound like what some people may say is character. Like your character is shown when stressed. So, and yet it's not quite the same. So how do you tease those out?
It's almost there. I would say it's almost there, but I think even character is a combination of several things. I think attributes just gets to some very elemental building blocks of character. I think character includes a couple other things like identity and sometimes even ideology. It will inform character as well. So values and things like that. So I think character is almost there. But
Yeah.
these elemental things, these qualities, whether I'm adaptable or not, whether I'm patient or not, whether I'm situation aware or not, they're just at the baseline, and they're a building block of what eventually becomes character.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. I think anytime we can get a different lens at an idea, it's of value. And I think the attribute lens is brilliant. We'll talk about specific attributes in a bit, but I'm wondering about environment and context. So, for example, courage is an attribute in the book, part of the grit category, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
A past guest has told me something along the lines of, we shouldn't ask whether someone is gritty. We should ask when they are and when they're not. It's context.
Yeah.
And so, for example, there are situations where I might come off to somebody as very courageous, but in other situations I'm not. So what's the role of context and environment with the attributes?
Yeah, so context does matter. However, they are still quite elemental, and courage is a great one to use as an example, because courage, by definition, is the ability to step into our fear and discomfort. So really, just from a neurological level, when we begin to feel fear, our amygdala starts to get tickled, our autonomic arousal goes up. Our brain begins to offer us two choices. The choices are fight or flight. We've heard them before. Okay, we've heard freeze before too, but neuroscience has proven that freeze is kind of like an oscillation between the two. You're kind of deciding whether or not you should fight or flight. But really specifically, whether you fight or flight, there's a specific switch that gets clicked in the brain. Okay, and if you decide to fight, i.e., step into your fear, the switch gets clicked. That is the courage switch, and we actually get rewarded for that. We get a dopamine reward for stepping into our fear. All this to say is that courage switch in our brain is inaccessible unless there is fear present. We know that. We've heard it before, right? So what does this mean from an attribute perspective? It means, yes, certainly, courage fear is subjective, right? And so courage as an attribute, and whether or not you're flipping that switch has less to do with kind of the lifestyle you lead, and more to do with how often and frequently and habitually you're stepping into your discomfort. So, I can say that you could have a bunch of Navy SEALs in a gunfight in Afghanistan with Al Qaeda who are physiologically feeling less fear than the 8-year-old you just asked to step in front of the classroom and introduce themselves, right? So it's not necessarily about what we do for a living. It's about how often are you stepping into your discomfort. And you can be a generally anxious person and have high courage because you're just every day, 10 times a day or 100 times a day, stepping into your discomfort. And if you're doing that and doing that and doing that, you're higher on the courage attribute. So that's what that means. And certainly the environment is subjective, but the attribute itself is the action of that, right? And so, so I do keep a gray area in terms of our familiarity with environments tends to allow an attribute probably to show up a little bit more smoothly. But I would say in most cases I default to those times of stress, uncertainty, and challenge, and where are those attributes showing, and that's our default.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really helpful. I appreciate how you unpack that. To understand some of the attributes, I just want to take a scenario. And this is a real conversation with a chief information officer where he said to me, he goes, my biggest concern is that my direct reports get defensive when they're confronted. Okay? Now, these are like seasoned senior VPs, right? But they lose their cool when people from other parts of the business question maybe their recommendations, or if they demand changes to project scope. And the CIO, guess what he wanted? He wanted training on executive presence and presentation skills, which is looking through the skills lens, right? Yeah. And so I'm wondering if attributes maybe like courage, situational awareness, resilience, empathy, maybe some conscientiousness there might need some work here. But regardless, I'm interested, how would you approach the executive's concerns from an attributes lens instead of a skills lens?
Yeah. Well, there's two versions here, right? I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like he wanted training for people who were going to approach the executives, or he wanted training for the executives to be able to take feedback better. Was that the
second? Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So I think the idea would be you can certainly think about some skills you could apply in those situations, but their inability to take feedback is directly related to their attributes, right? And we could talk about what those attributes are. It could be humility in some cases. It could be whichever we want. But if you are in fact lower on an attribute, you can develop that attribute. So, and again, I want to, just for your audience's sake, I'd like everybody to think of these attributes as we all have all of them. And now we have actually, we work with 41 attributes, as you know, because you took the assessment. It's not just the 25 in the book, but we all have all of them. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each, right? So I always kind of use adaptability as the example. I mean, if 10 is high and 1 is low, I would probably be about a level 8 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow. Okay. Someone else might be a level 3, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow, and there's friction there. They're still adaptable because all human beings are. So it's really about where you show up, and you can kind of think of these attributes as like dimmer switches along a wall, and all these dimmer switches are at different settings, and that starts to speak to our performance and how we operate, right? So someone who doesn't take feedback very well, right? You could say, well, that person might be a little bit low on humility, okay? They might be low on open-mindedness. They might be low on curiosity, right? Whatever those are, But say you want to develop an attribute you're low on. First, there's 3 things you have to consider. So first is you have to know you're low on it. Okay, that's number 1. Second is you have to have a motivation or desire or need to develop it. And why do I say that? It's because just because you're low on an attribute doesn't necessarily mean you need to develop it. In fact, developing it might be detrimental to what you're trying to do, right? I always kind of say that the comic with too much empathy is going to be a lousy comedian, right? Because how can you make fun of, how can you make jokes about a funeral if you have too much empathy, right? So you want to make sure those first 2. I'm low on it, and developing it is something I want to and need to do. But then the third one's the most important. That is, you have to put yourself into environments that deliberately test and tease that attribute. So if someone, for example, wants to develop their patience, they have to go find environments that test and tease their patience, whatever it looks like for them. It could be, I'm going to go deliberately drive in traffic, or I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in. I always say have kids, that'll develop patience, right? But whatever that is. And so I think in that scenario, the first objective would be figure out what attributes these folks are low on that is causing that type of performance, and then ask, okay, what are some things we can do to help them develop those attributes? Again, in a simplified way, I think a lot of executives, people in high positions who don't like to take criticism, that's a lot of ego a lot of times too. So sometimes it's about listening and putting down one's ego and humility and things like that. So, but that's how I kind of broad brush that answer.
Yeah, that's actually really good. I appreciate that. And I think this is the first book I've ever seen narcissism even remotely put into a positive light. Would you mind mentioning that? Because people can misread even the way I said that, but sure. Would you unpack that particular attribute?
Yeah. So I was struggling with this because I was trying to figure out what those attributes that drive us. And so it's one of the drive attributes. So, what drives us as humans. And I think my hesitation to use it is the same hesitation most people feel when they read it. And that's because we often confuse general narcissism with psychological, with narcissistic, with clinical narcissistic personality disorder. But so when I did this, I got a copy of the DSM-5, which is the psych Bible, right? And it has all the psych disorders in there. It has a few pages on narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. In those pages, there's 9 criteria that the physician will read through. And if that physician can say answer yes to 5 or more, that means the patient is disordered, right? They consider the patient disordered. But a couple of things here. First of all, only about 6% of the population have the disorder. And so, second of all, when you read those 9, so I read through those 9, and I'm happy to say that I couldn't say yes to 5 or more, right? But as I read through those 9, I was not innocent of everything I was reading. So in other words, I was like, well, sometimes I feel this way, sometimes I think this way, right? And so then I kind of backed it up a little bit and said, okay, well, why did I become a Navy SEAL in the first place? Okay, I was a 22-year-old kid. It was in the 90s. There was nothing really going on at the time. I was a patriot, sure, but ultimately one of the biggest reasons was I wanted to see if I could be a badass. I wanted to see if I could do something very few people could do. And so then I asked my SEAL buddies why they became SEALs, and they said basically the same thing. Sure, they were patriots, all that stuff, but they wanted to see if they could do something very few people could do. So then I looked up the general definition of narcissism, just general narcissism. And that basic definition is the desire to stand out, be recognized, be adored, right? Be made feel special, okay? And I'm telling you right now, every single human being on this planet at some point in their lives wants to stand out, be recognized, be made feel special. It's a very elemental human desire, to human need. So narcissism in its general sense, all of us have it to some degree. And it can, in fact, and often is, in fact, the impetus to some very audacious goals. Because why else would you want to be the best salesperson or the best athlete or the Navy SEAL or the best podcast or whatever that is? And so it's a very natural thing. And I think it was important for me, and it's important for all of us to look at some of this stuff and not be afraid to talk about it, because we all have it. We just have to understand how to metabolize it in a healthy, positive way. So that's why it made the book. And it's one of my most fun to talk about, because it always turns heads and people always ask about it, right? But once people understand the definition, like, okay, wait a second, I can see that. I can see how that is part of every human being, just to what level.
Right. No, and you explain it really well in the book. It's just so funny, because we trip over the term, but after you explain it in the book, you go, well, yeah. And even as you explain it here, it's just when it tilts too far, actually one way or the other, for that matter.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. The person who people say, hey, why would it be bad to have almost zero narcissism, right? And that's a wallflower. That's someone who has no impetus to drive, to like stand out, to be the best, to do whatever, right? And you have to be careful of that too. You want to be driven in certain ways, and narcissism is a huge driver.
Yeah, I think that what the CIO wants in some ways is what most people listening to us wants if they are running a team. You want a high-performing team. Yeah, throughout the book, you tease out the difference between an optimal performing team from a high-performing team. So tell us about that distinction and why you find that helpful.
Well, kind of. The distinction is actually more the difference between peak performance and optimal performance, right? And so a high-performing team performs optimally. And the distinction is one that I had to reconcile early on. That is, there's always been a movement, there still is, around peak performance. Everybody talks about peak performance. They want to peak here, peak there, peak everywhere. And even when I was still in the SEAL teams, there were like people would tell me, well, you Navy SEALs are the ultimate peak performers. And I used to disagree with that statement. And the reason is because peak, by definition, is an apex. And there's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down, right? The other thing about peak is peak often has to be planned for, scheduled, and prepared for. So, for example, the professional football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on Sunday, okay? We don't get to do that. SEALs don't get to do that. None of us in regular life get to do that. And so I used to say, well, we're in fact optimal performers. Optimal performance means I'm going to do the very best in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment, okay? Now, sometimes my best looks like peak, okay? And everything's clicking, everything's flow states, all that stuff, right? But sometimes my best in the moment is I am just head down, nugging it out, going step by step, and that's all I got. And it's dirty, and it's gritty, and it's ugly, and it's hard, right? That is still performing optimally. And so optimal performance allows us a couple things. First, it allows us to celebrate those times when we're not at peak, right? We were just gutting it out, and it's dirty, and it's gritty, and it's ugly, and it's hard, right? And I can't tell you how many operations we went on. We'd come back from the mission, and we'd be like, man, that was ugly, right? But we got the job done. We just did what we had to do. But the other thing is it allows us what I call responsible energy management. In other words, I don't need to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. I can be at some other energy level. And I will say this, there's oftentimes a myth I'll bust about Navy SEALs. You might see it on TV or movies where a SEAL team is getting ready to go on a mission, and they get all huddled up and they start hoo-yawing and high-fiving before they get on the helicopter, right? That never happens, ever, okay? In fact, most of the time we'd be in the helicopters flying into combat, and the guys around me would be sleeping. They'd be napping. And the reason is because we don't know what's coming. We don't know how long we're going to be out there. We don't know what energy level is going to be required. We're not going to waste an ounce of our energy doing things we don't need to do. And so optimal performance can be this umbrella underneath which peak lives and gutting it out lives, and even recovery lives, right? And that's what the high-performing team does. A high-performing team is, by definition, a team that not only performs when things are going great, but also when things are not going great. That's the number one biggest distinction between a regular team and a high-performing team. It's the team that performs when things aren't going great, and they do so by performing optimally.
Yeah, I really like that. In the project management world, there's an approach called agile project management, and the approach is a lot of times put ownership and decision-making heavy on the team instead of the manager or the boss or the chief or the officer in charge, whatever. All team members in those sort of settings try to look at themselves as leaders and what's the current situation and who needs to step up. And I thought of that with your concept of dynamic subordination in your book. Yeah. And so why is that important for SEALs, but how does that also work on a business team?
Yeah, well, dynamic subordination is a task organization model that I kind of, it dawned on me as I saw, especially training SEALs, but certainly as I operated and worked and led and and lived with SEALs, right? We never filled any classical task organization model. We weren't a pyramid, the top-down pyramid. We weren't a flat line where everybody's outranked, everybody's on the same level and all that stuff. And we weren't even an upside-down pyramid, servant leadership model. What we were just kind of like, we were more like an amoeba or a blob, And dynamic subordination means that a team understands that problems and challenges and issues can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to the problem, the most capable, immediately steps up and takes lead, and everybody follows, right? And then the environment shifts, and then someone else steps up. I also call it alpha hopping, and that alpha position just hops. And what that means is every high-performing team and dynamically subordinating team understands that your rank has nothing to do with your contribution to the team. It's what you bring to the team. It's what your whatever qualities, attributes, skills, whatever competencies you bring to that team is what defines your position in that team. And that position is based on environment. I always say I was an officer in the SEAL teams. I went on hundreds of combat missions overseas. I was in charge of every single one of them. It didn't mean I was always being supported. In fact, most of the time was opposite, right? I was supporting other people, whether it's my breachers, my snipers, my assaulters, whatever that. Sometimes the environment would shift and they'd be supporting me, but it was all environmentally based. And so the highest performing teams operate with a dynamic subordination model, and the leader steps up when someone steps up, takes lead, they get supported, and then steps back. And it's constant swap. It's like a flock of birds or a school of fish, and that's how it operates.
Such a powerful idea, isn't it? Because if I imagine in the setting you were in, it's deadly if somebody doesn't step up. But in the context of business, a lot of times you hear people go, "Well, we're going to wait until we're told," right? They're not taking the initiative. So
well, the good thing about that, Andy, is that in a dynamically subordinating team, someone always steps up.
Right.
Yeah. No one never. No. There's no pause because as soon as there's an issue, someone's close, they step up, right? Because if they step up and they realize they're not the right person, they immediately step back and someone else steps up. It's just everybody's ready to do that, and it's a really cool environment.
I bet it's difficult for people to envision until you've been there, and then once you've been there, you hate it when you don't have it.
Well, so a real simple way to envision this in a civilian sense, and I think I use this example in the book, is a commercial airliner, right? So the commercial airliner, none of us would disagree with the fact or debate the fact that the captain is in charge of that aircraft. Everybody's okay with that, right? However, if a captain is taxiing his or her aircraft out to the takeoff and they get a call from the maintenance person, and the maintenance person says, "Hey, I just found a problem with your aircraft. You need to turn around." No captain worth their wings is going to ignore that call. They're immediately going to subordinate to the maintenance person, turn that aircraft around, and go back to the gate. They realize they have to deplane the aircraft so they can fix it. Captain doesn't step up and takes charge of that either. Now the flight attendant steps up and takes charge, right? So in a real simple way, this is dynamic subordination. The environment dictates who's in charge in the moment, right? And we let ourselves either support or be supported, but it's all about the team, and it's all about executing the best you can in that particular environment.
And you can see where courage and humility are required there, right?
100%.
For someone to speak up and someone to listen.
Yeah.
Like I hear people say, like in an OR, the surgeon used to rule, was king or queen, right? And people wouldn't speak up, but people can at least speak up. Now, maybe they don't take over in that regard, but it is an interesting dynamic. Yeah.
And by the way, this is what makes the problem that the CIO buddy of yours was talking about so problematic. Because if someone is unwilling to take criticism, then they are unwilling to understand what they're doing wrong. They're unwilling to step back and cede control. That is a dangerous place to be in. And so our whole philosophy in the SEAL teams, regardless of what level was, feedback is immediate and constant, and it doesn't matter where it was coming from, because oftentimes it come from the environment because it was that dangerous. But for us, feedback is absolutely essential. And if I'm doing something wrong or can do something better, I want to and need to know as fast as possible, and I don't take it personally because everything about my action is for the betterment of the team.
Yeah, you said in the book, beware the fearless leader, I think it was.
Yeah.
Beware the non-open-minded leader, maybe it is, or whatever. Yeah, for sure. Now, let's say, based on my introductory comments, that someone's looking to fill an open position, and interviewing is it's a classic approach to say competencies or skills. If somebody was going through an interviewing process as the person doing the interviewing candidates, how could they use this attribute idea to try to improve the likelihood that they're going to hire the person that they really want instead of just looking at skills?
No, it's an important question, and the first thing most important thing is to understand what attributes you're looking for. And so the work I did in the SEAL teams and the work we do now with our company is we help organizations understand what they're looking for. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, then it's an exercise in futility. So what are the attributes? The list of attributes that make up a great Navy SEAL team is going to look different than the list of attributes that make up a great sales team or a business team or whatever, surgical team, right? So I have to understand that first. And then when you start to implement some sort of hiring process, you begin to implement some ways that you can tease those out by injecting some stress and challenge and uncertainty into the process. Doesn't have to be Machiavellian and doesn't have to be as extreme as SEAL training, okay? But I'll give you a couple examples. So experiential examples are always experiential models are always the best because, experience just, you see things more viscerally. So an experiential example would be, so imagine, Andy, you and I wanted to figure out a great or hire a good salesperson. So this candidate comes on a Friday and we say, hey, come in Monday morning and you're going to sell us this pencil. Okay. Weekend goes by, we come in Monday morning, the person shows up and proceeds just to wow us with their sales presentation on the pencil. We're like, oh my God, that was the best thing we've ever seen. Problem is we would not have learned very much. All we would have learned is that person's good at going home, preparing a sales presentation and giving a sales presentation. Okay. So instead, what we do is on Friday, we tell that person, hey, come in Monday, you're going to sell us this pencil. Monday morning, they come in, they say, and we say, hey, the plan's changed. Okay. You're not selling us the pencil anymore. You're going to sell us this cup. And there's no audio visual, right? So just go with it. So now what you and I have to do in that moment is we have to deliberately divorce ourselves from skills assessments, okay? Because what we're about to see is going to be ugly, okay? However, we're not looking at skills anymore. We're looking at how this person behaves. What do they do with it? Do they make jokes? Do they make light of it? Do they kind of just go on the fly? They make it happen, make it work? Or do they make excuses, kick the dirt, spiral downward, right? And now we're looking at attributes. And attributes you can always see on the periphery of what's going on. And so injecting that uncertainty, challenge, and stress allows us to start seeing that. You can do this experientially. You can also do it with a question, right? So you can ask a question in a way that allows someone to step out of their normal comfort zone a little bit. An example is I was working with a group of folks out in Colorado. They're a construction company. Really good group of guys. They were what I call uber patriots. Okay, they were just flags everywhere, super pro military, super first responder. Really good guys. Almost over the top in some ways, but funny in a nice way, in a funny way. And one of their top attributes that they realized that they were looking for in their candidates was open-mindedness. And so the CEO and I were talking. He said, "Rich, how can I ask a question to determine or see someone's levels of open-mindedness?" And I said, well, let me give you an example. He said, okay. I said, give me 3 good reasons right now to burn the American flag. And you could see he almost had an aneurysm when I asked him that, right? Because I could give you 3 good reasons. I mean, it'd be easy, right? But the idea was, could I break him out of his comfort zone and get him out of his fishbowl to look at this thing from a different angle? Now, I didn't press him to it. I didn't make him answer me, but you can actually ask questions in a way that actually tease out some of these attributes. And again, it's on the periphery. So A, know what you're looking for, and B, look at and this is other work we also do with teams and organizations. We help them with their hiring process, and we can tweak hiring processes. Just say, hey, instead of asking this question, which focuses on skills, just change this around, and now you're looking at attributes, And so you can actually tweak a little bit just by implementing a little bit of stress, challenge, and uncertainty.
There's a line used in the book. It's something along the lines of is it difference between training and education?
Yeah. You train,
and that comes to mind here. Right? How's that work?
This is a joint war college line. I think we train for certainty, we educate for uncertainty, and what this essentially means is, training for certainty is basically skills training. I'm going to train in those things that I need to know, almost at a mastery level. I need to know how to I need to know how to raise, aim, and fire my weapon in an accurate way. I need to know how to utilize my radio and shoot, move, and communicate. Those are skills that I can train to generate mastery. But those are skills that I know there are certain environments that I'm going to be using those skills in. Education is for uncertainty, and education is experiential almost. I'm going to put myself into different and diverse circumstances and experiences so that I design and create and generate new perspectives in my brain that allow me to have a more open aperture when uncertainty hits, right? So it's always good. We always need to train for certainty to a certain degree, and SEALs are no different. We had to know how to shoot, move, and communicate. Those are things we needed to train. But we also tried to educate ourselves, and education can mean anything. It can mean I'm going to go to college. I'm going to go on a trip. I'm going to read different books that are outside of my normal genre, to just flood my brain and my development with perspectives and ideas that I otherwise wouldn't have experienced. Because what that's doing is it's creating new neural networks. It's allowing for creative things to happen, and it's giving you a more open optic from which you can operate when the environment is completely unknown. Because again, in uncertainty, people make the mistake of thinking that when you're in uncertainty, your first job, your first objective is to do something, right? But that's not the case. It's not to act. Your first objective is to understand so that you might act. And so in that process of understanding, the more open perspective or optics you have, the faster you're going to be able to operate.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many things I'd love to talk with you about, Rich, but people need to get a copy of the book to get them all. Let's end with this. We've got a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of some ways that attributes have helped you and your wife when it comes to marriage and parenting?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So marriage, obviously, between two adults, it's good to understand attributes and how they work together, and what the work we do. And so in whatever team, and I always define team by definition, even a high-performing team, is any group of two or more people working together towards a common goal or objective, right? Which means there are teams everywhere. It's not just sports teams and SEAL teams and business teams. A great marriage is a high performing team, right? But teams work the best when you understand how attributes mesh together, kind of like zippers. And some are common, right? Some we both have a preponderance of, but others, like I'm low and she's high, or she's high and I'm low, and that works beautifully. I always use patience as an example. Like I'm typically high on patience. I'm a high patience person. My wife is typically low patience. She's low on patience. That's worked beautifully for us in our 23-year marriage and raising two kids. Because when patience is required, I step up. Mm-hmm. When impatience is required, she steps up. And so her patience or her impatience has prevented me from procrastinating or taking too long on a decision or whatever. My patience has prevented her impatience from moving too fastly, making decisions too quickly, right? Whatever that is. And so you can generate teams and marriages in a way that you understand each other attributes ways. Now, when it comes to kids, I'm always cautionary and the reason is because we are, as human beings, from birth to about 22, 23 years old, we are sponges. Our frontal lobe is still developing, right? Our limbic develops fairly quickly, but our frontal lobe is still developing, which means we are still generating a huge amount of neural networks to define us as human beings. And so I'm very hesitant to label kids. I maybe end of high school into college, it's okay, right? But I'm hesitant to label kids in terms of what attributes they might be high on or what attributes they're low on. What we try to do, and what I recommend parents do, is really just inform kids. And we've actually been reached out to by a bunch of different academic institutions, and we are slowly trying to generate curriculum to do this. It's a super big project, so we have to be able to get there. But it would be designed to inform kids about this stuff so that we can help them generate what I call habits of healthy introspection. I think the best habits we can develop in our kids or growing up is the ability to look at ourselves and say, okay, let me interrogate my behavior a little bit and see how I'm doing. What am I good at? What am I bad at? What do I need to work on, in a very non-judgmental way, right? And so that's what we would endeavor to do. And I think for parents, throwing your kids into just different diverse experiences, to let them just feel out the world and experience it and discover more about themselves is the best way to do it. One of my buddies who's an author as well, his name is Dan Coyle. He wrote a book called The Talent Code and the Culture Code. And I remember Dan saying, I just try to throw as many things in front of my kid's windshield as possible, and again, we do this in a non-judgmental way. It's not like, I'm going to make sure my kid is awesome at this or whatever. And I'm, just let them do stuff. And if something comes in, and sometimes things will come in, like, I don't like that, and they brush it away. That's fine, right? You just see what sticks. I think that's the best way to introduce attributes concepts to kids from maybe birth till about, at least 18. So. Yeah.
It's funny. I've seen the tendency in myself sometimes to bubble wrap my kids. And if I'm not careful, I might even do that. But I think one thing I take away from the book is give them opportunities for autonomy and learning and stretching, and throw it at their windshield, I guess. Yeah. In a safe and in a way that, doesn't label them. I really like that idea. So they don't think, well, I'm low in, No, because
Yeah. Well, and again, I think the just from a neuroscience, I love neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, of course. I try to hang with neuroscience friends, right, and a couple of them are good friends, but one of my good friends, Andrew Huberman, who has a podcast, a pretty big podcast, the Huberman Lab, he and I were talking about this, and one of the things he describes is that when we learn, when neural networks are created in the learning process, you get a network connection, and then it gets myelinated, right? And that myelin is what allows for that information to travel faster and faster. And fully myelinated connections are information is traveling. That's when you learn something, you do something without thinking. That's that type of thing. Yeah. Anyway, all this to say that you can 100x that process. That connection and myelination process when three things are present in our environment. Those three things are intensity, novelty, and focus. Okay, this is exactly why we learn more from our mistakes than we do our successes. Because when we make a mistake, right? This is the difference between being told a stove is hot or touching a hot stove. When you're told a stove is hot, there's nothing there, right? When you touch a hot stove, it's immediately intense, novel, and you have deep focus. Okay. So when we make a mistake, when we screw up, we have all three of those things present. All this to say is, if we're not allowing our children a little bit of rope, I mean, that's the most difficult part as a parent is how much do you let them go on the bike before they fall down, right? But those falls are actually what allow them to learn the fastest. And so we don't want to deny our kids the ability to fail, because those failures are super highways of learning and development.
Yeah. Oh man, it's so good for those listening. This discussion, it's just really a small taste of what's in Rich's book. To get a fuller understanding of attributes and how to leverage them, get a copy of Rich's book, The Attributes. So put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So Rich, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me.